Hi and welcome to this video in the MRDCL EPS series, and in this video we're going to look at sort of some tips and tricks that hopefully will make your life a bit easier and some things that might catch you out when you come to start using EPS and building your own templates. So first of all, I'm going to reiterate something that's been covered in previous videos actually, but I want to really make the point really of how important this is. And that is that in all the video demonstrations, I've left the workbook open when I've been working, only to avoid flicking screens too much. But I really can't stress enough, it's very important that you close your workbook before you compile your MRDCL run. And perhaps I could explain why that is. What actually happens is that MRDCL uses a Microsoft driver to open the workbook and read it, or view the workbook, or take its contents. And what it actually does when it grabs something from the workbook is that if it's open, after every time it reads any cell in your workbook, it will check to make sure the workbook hasn't changed. So say you're reading thousands of different cells in a workbook or worksheet, that's going to mean that after each one of those reads, of all those thousand reads, it's going to check whether the workbook's changed or not. Whereas if it's closed, it knows the file's locked and safe, and in that case it can just run at full speed. And this doesn't just make a little bit of difference, it can make a huge bit of difference, and it just sort of goes in line with the size of the workbook. So if you've got a big workbook that might have, say, 100 sheets in it, your run times will be huge. They could be probably 100 times longer than they would be if you ran the same procedure or the same STP file with the workbook closed. But even so, even with probably quite a small workbook, perhaps not as small as these examples here, it will make a difference, and you can get runs that take sort of perhaps 10-30 seconds going up to being 10 minutes. So I can't stress enough, it's really important that you get in the habit of shutting your workbooks before you actually start to compile and execute your runs. And indeed, there's been occasions when I've obviously forgotten to shut my workbook when it's a big workbook, and you realise that because the run's taking longer than you would expect. Then you see the workbook is actually left open in a window on your computer, and at that point it's actually usually better to close it, which will crash the MRDCL run and restart it. I just find that you don't know how long it's going to take, and you can easily spend 10, 20, 30 minutes waiting for it to compile. It will work, but it'll just take a lot longer than normal. So that's enough about that point there. What we're going to do here is going to work through a very simple example here and just pick out some things that can trip you up and are important, and also indicate one or two tools, I think, and ways of working that might just help you. So this is really sort of, just looking at things that might trip you up and just one or two little benefits that might not have come out of the previous videos, which were sort of much more factual and took you through the process of building your own templates. And indeed in EPS 206 it's quite a complex template that it built for you there. So the first thing I want to look at then is just to write a script that reads this, and I'm going to read these codes and texts here. There's only 5 of them. Now of course normally you wouldn't write EPS script to read this because it's so simple. You would just say that it's in column 10 or whatever it is, pick up codes 1 to 5 and then just put those texts in. But we're going to do this in EPS just to look at some things that can happen if it's not handled in perhaps quite the perfect way. Alright, so I've got this script here. I've got an empty script, so I'm just going to key in something here. I'm going to just say DSQ1, so it's column 5, and now I'm going to write a script that picks up those 5 codes. Now, to do that, I've got to open the workbook first, so I'm going to put in a line at the top here. I don't see it, you haven't got to put it at the top, but I can't ever see a reason for not putting it at the top. It can be harder to find if you don't keep it at the top. So I'm going to open up the workbook, and then it's good practice to close it at the bottom. Otherwise, if the run crashes, you could leave that file open and again start to slow down your computer. Okay, so we've got the workbook open. I'm now going to loop through the codes to pick up the codes in that worksheet we're looking at just now. So I'm going to say db loop, db1 is db XLS, and the worksheet is called example 1. And I want it to pick up the codes. Now, in a previous video, you were advised to pick up the codes in a set command. So let's say set db1.code. So let's just go back to our worksheet. So that's the column that's headed code there. And in here, we can just use the index code comma, and then we can shut the loop. And let's just check and see if that's doing what we would expect. As I said, I've just left it. I'm leaving this workbook open here because it is so small. That's not good practice generally. All right, so it's now picked up codes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now let's just see what happens if we don't use a set command. Again, this was mentioned in a previous video, but perhaps not in the depth I'm covering here. So let's take that line out and just put into here db1.code, because in theory you would expect it to pull in that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 there. So let's run that, and now we'll see why it's important to actually use a set command. So what's happening here now is you'll see it's pulled in 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, 5.0, and what's actually happening is here the Microsoft driver is telling MRDCL that it's got a number in there, but it's actually returning 1 decimal place. Now that might not matter in many cases, but to MRDCL that is actually quite important, because what this actually means is here that if you pick up 1.0, it's treating dot as and it's going to be looking for 1 and 0 in column 5, and then 2 and 0, 3 and 0, 4 and 0, 5 and 0. And this is just one of those quirks where you'll find if you get a table that's empty, this might be the reason. You haven't used a set command to pick up the numeric value, and so it's returning 1.0, which MRDCL interprets as 1 and 0, which is pretty much certainly not what you want. So that's why we use a set command, and let's change that back. And just to make this perhaps a little bit clearer, people do sometimes get confused with the column headed code and the index headed code in examples like this. So I'm going to call this one my code, which picks up db1.code, and then we would use the index my code. So that's the sort of difference between an index and a column. So my code is the index, and we're going to just pull in that index as we did before, and that should work absolutely fine. And now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. All right, so far so good with that. Now we want to pick up the texts in there, and what I start to get my first problem then, and this is something that you commonly encounter with EPS, so it's a technique that's worth noting. So let's go for a loop again, give it the same name. I don't have to give it the same name, but I am. And I can pull in the text as db1.text with a semicolon, dbn db1, and a quote comma. Now that's going to hit a problem, so let's just compile that and see what problem we get. And this is a common problem that you'll hit over and over again with text that you pull in through EPS. And what's happening here, it's telling me I've got 6 items in my labels, whereas I've only got 5 codes. And the reason for that is that it's put a semicolon here, and then it's counting what's after it up to that semicolon, up to the quote symbol there, as an extra blank, if you like, piece of text. But nonetheless, it's treating it as a sixth piece of text, or a 6th label. And so although it's only got 5 codes, as we can see at the top, it thinks there's 6 labels. So we need to get rid of this semicolon that I'm highlighting here. And this is a technique that I say you regularly use. And the way to do that, or my way of doing that, is to say, okay, well, before I start this loop here, let's just set count equal to 0. And then each time I pick up a code, I'll set count equals count plus 1. What that means is when I get here, the value of count will hold the number of codes. Indeed, I can prove that. And this is something that I do for debug purposes sometimes. If I get an error that I can't spot, I can say there are count codes for this variable. So what that will do is, as a comment, it will substitute in here, so it will still work within a comment, the number of codes that we've got. So if we just save that and compile it, still got my error, but I can now see that it really does know that it's got 5 codes for this variable, which of course is obvious in this particular case, but in a bigger variable might be more difficult to spot. Now what I can do when I come to this loop is I can say, well, if I set got to 0, and then each time I get a label in, I add 1 on, what I can do is I can jump over that semicolon, which is what I want to omit, for the last item, or the last item in the list of labels. So what I can say here is skip 99 on got equal to count. So what I'm saying is that I want to jump over that semicolon when I've got to the 6th label in the text column, and when of course it matches that value up here. So there we go, let's do that, and now my code is working. It's skipped that semicolon, and so now it doesn't put out another semicolon. When it's got to the 5th one, it's jumping over it, and MRDCL is quite comfortable with that fact. It's got a blank on the end of this line and a quote column on a separate line. MRDCL strips off all leading and trailing blanks in text, so it doesn't matter if that has hundreds of blank characters on there and hundreds of blank lines. It would still read that and take off all the blank spaces on the end and not misbehave in any way. Alright, so we've done something here which is quite good now. We've got through a couple of techniques which make it a bit easier to handle. Now let's look at making things a little bit more complicated. Let's say we want in here 1 to 5 any brand recalled. Now you'll see here I've got a mix of numeric codes, and then this one down here 1.5 is certainly not a numeric code. In terms of Excel, it's not a numeric code. It's just picking up some text effectively, because 1.5 isn't a number. So now I'm going to have a bit of a problem when I come to process this, because I want to treat these as numbers and put them into an index, whereas this is not a number, and so when it tries to put that into my code, it will crash. So let's just see that running, and you can see now I've got an error, and it got upset here. It didn't know what to do with this code here, this text here, and as a result of that, this has crashed as well quite badly. So we now need to have a way of dealing with a worksheet where there's a mixture of numeric values that we want to go into a set command and something that's is picking up numbers, but actually as far as Excel is concerned, this is just text. Now when you get this mix, the way you deal with that is that you have to store this column here as text in Excel. So this has to be formatted as text. Now unfortunately Excel's a little bit stubborn here, that if we just right click and say format cells and we pick text, it won't do it. It'll stop me doing it. It'll pretend it's done it, and it'll ignore me. What you have to do to really convert this to text is to go to the data menu, click on text to columns. I choose fixed width. I don't think it matters there. Click next, and then you must click this text here and click finish. Now you know it's worked, because anything that's a numeric only, which is that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you'll see that little green triangle in the top left hand corner, which indicates that it's been saved as text. So now that I've done that and I've saved it, actually I don't need to use a set command and use an index. I can just take that out, and now I can use db1.code and it will work perfectly well. And if we look at the listing now, you can see it's picked up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as I want it, 1.5 here, and everything is compiling correctly. So what this means is that if you format a column that's got numerics in it as text, it will work. It won't return that now as 1.0 because it's got that green triangle in the top left hand corner, which means it's text as far as Excel is concerned. The driver that reads this workbook, what MRDCL uses to read this workbook, will treat 1 as 1 and 2 as 2, not as 1.0, 2.0, and it will work. So this is an alternative way that many people work. They just format all their columns as text, and then you don't have to use a set command. Personally, I prefer using a set command because if you start pasting something into another worksheet, if I pasted a code 6 in here from another worksheet, that probably wouldn't be formatted as text, and it would set it back to a numeric again, and you can get your sheet in a bit of a mess then and things not working as you expect. So I like using set commands when I can, and then just formatting as text when I have to, and it somehow seems to work in my mind that way quite well. When you do text to columns, I think you can only do one column at a time, so that becomes quite a painful process if you've got lots of fields. So if you think you're going to need to format as text, do it before you start rather than after the event, because text to columns is a slightly clumsy business. All right, so let's done some work sort of managing a worksheet a little bit better and learning some more. Another thing that trips people up is that we don't really talk about the loops that MRDCL is carrying out when it's doing EPS. What it's doing effectively is it's starting at row 2, or the row after the header, and going down to the end of the sheet. So when I say db loop db1 equals, what it's actually saying is start at the second row and carry on to the end. Now again, Excel can get confused. So if I were to say type a 9 in here and type something in and then possibly delete it, if I hit Control N, which means go to the end of the sheet, you'll see it dives back here to this cell. Because I had something there and deleted it, it thinks that's still the last cell of the sheet. And if I save that now and run, it actually has worked okay on that occasion, but I have found times when it will carry on trying to deal with empty cells, and of course if you've got that empty cell down the bottom of the sheet, it can run on for some time picking up nothing or rubbish. So it is something to be careful of. I tend to make a point if I add things in the bottom to just go down here, delete any empty rows, save it, and I then know that my sheet is ending where it should do. It'll certainly read to where it thinks the end of the sheet is, and Control N is the keys you need to press in Excel to check where it is really at the end. If you happen to have it right down there on the 1 millionth row, it would read that whole worksheet. If Control N took you there, it would read the whole worksheet, and it would take a long time. Even if it generated the correct code for you, it would be slow. So that's something to be worth being careful about, and that can easily happen if you start pasting things between sheets or from another workbook to actually fill up your workbook. So that's a couple of things that are worth noting about the bottom of the sheet. I'm going to go on to another subject now. We've got this code here working quite well, I think. What I want to look at now is actually how you develop these, and this has been covered in another video, but I just want to go over this now, perhaps having learned some of the more complex tasks. And one of the tips I've got for people is that I find just typing that sort of script in quite difficult. This is a pretty easy example, but I find that quite hard to read, even as a very experienced user of EPS, and it's not something that's easy just to type out of your head. And I always encourage people to do what I call reverse engineering. So what I would do in an occasion like this would be to do something like this. I would type it out as it's supposed to be, so that when you build your template, you can sort of just reverse engineer each bit of it one thing at a time, and then you can have a general purpose template that you can use on other projects or share with colleagues or whatever it might be. So I would start by just typing it out, or if it's something quite long, I might just sort of do a dot in there so that I know I'm missing out a whole list of brands. I didn't need to type all 5 out there really. But it then allows me to start building the parameters that I'm going to feed this function, this EPS function, and thinking about what it is I need to do. So what I might do here is I might say that data var is Q1 and it's on column 5. So there are 2 parameters I want to set. I can set that as var1, that is var.2, and then I can say, okay, well the next thing I want to do is pick up the codes in that worksheet. So how do I do that? And then I can start to think about using some code like this, and then I can come to do some code like this. And I think that just works better. Now, as I say, this is a fairly simple piece of EPS script, which is more illustrative than actually something you would use for real. But when you get to some of the complex examples, like in EPS 206, you really do, I think, need to do it that way, because then you can see what you're changing, and you can track it one step at a time. You can reverse engineer one step at a time to make sure it's doing what you think it should be doing, and I think you'll have better results if you work that way. Alright, we're going to look at a couple of other functions that are available in EPS now that perhaps haven't been covered in other videos. I think they have been covered in other videos. So one thing we're going to look at is a line of code called dblines. Now dblines is quite a nice function that you get within the tools. So dblines is a way of setting an index value. So I'm going to call this num rows, and it allows you to set the number of, or calculate the number of rows in a workbook. So I can go into here, so what I can do is I can know before I do anything that there are so many rows in the worksheet. And again, I'm using a comment here to put the value out so I can see what I've got. So let's just compile that. And you can see now it's dropped out that there are 6 rows in the worksheet example 1. And you could argue there are 7 rows, but actually what it's doing, it's forgetting or dropping off, removing 1 for the header row. So there's 6 active rows plus a header, that means. And that can be quite useful. So if you wanted to do some tables, perhaps you wanted to do a table for each brand, for example, you could then use that as a loop. Perhaps in your table stage we haven't got enough code here, but you could just write a loop that said 1 to num rows, and then each table number was automatically 1 to 6 for those tables. Of course, we haven't got the variables here to do that, but that would be an example of what you could do. So you could, this hasn't got filters or anything else to do with it, but you can see you can use num rows then as a loop, having counted at the top how many rows there are in the particular worksheet that are active. So what I can do now is I can key in some tables here, and you'll see another trick here, which is probably more pre-processed than EPS, but something I like using. I often use the set command to do my table numbers. So I can say set plus t is q1 star q1. That's all I've got here. And if I want to get the table number of this table, I can just grab it there and put it in, pick up the value of t, which means if I did add another table in here, let's say we've got q1 in total, for example, it would have the value 2 here now, because that's the second table. And it means then I can carry that value of this table into the manip stage, regardless of what table number it is. So let's say I wanted to multiply this table by 10. I can't imagine why I want to do that, but let's just say I did. It would now just do that to table 2. If we run that, pick up our data file, and sure enough we've got 2 tables. The first one has the 1 respondent in it, and the second one has 10 times as many because I multiplied all the figures by 10. And that looks as though it works. So that's another sort of trick you can do with set commands. Not strictly EPS code that, but something that's quite useful. The other tool that you've got over and above dblines as well is controlling dbloop. Now sometimes you get worksheets from customers or other sources of information where your worksheet doesn't start in the first row. Maybe it's got some other text in it, or maybe you've got a worksheet where there's lots of code lists in the same workbook. So maybe question 1's code list is in rows 2 to 12, Question 2 is in rows 13 to 35. Question 3 is in 36 to 50, and so on. And so what you could do, if that's the particular case that you've got, you could say, well, I want to stop at a certain point and come out the loop if I hit a certain point, but also I might want to start at a different row. So let's just say that this had a blank line in here that had something like, this is the master worksheet. I could start one line later, so let's just save that. Save that. And now I can change my loops to begin one line later. And it looks a little bit strange, this syntax, I always think. After the equal sign, you put in brackets the line you want it to start at. So there we are, it should do that now. And with a bit of luck, it will do exactly what it did before. And there they are. So there we go, it's picked up the codes because I told it to start at the second active line. So 2 there doesn't mean the second row of the spreadsheet, it means the third row of the spreadsheet, because it's always one different because of the heading you've got in the first row. So it means the second active row of the, excluding the header in the worksheet. So that's another tool that you've got. So that's it from me in this video, just some tips and tricks there just to help you use EPS and not fall over one or two of the things that people can fall over when they're using EPS. The other videos really go into much more detail about how to build some templates and some of the thoughts you should have before you start to build a template. But hopefully this video has given you some help with some things that might just trip you up and some tips to make your life a little bit easier. Thank you for watching.